This question has been asked for thousands of years. What is the meaning of life? I mean, depending on who you ask, you're going to get all kinds of answers about the meaning of life. Why am I here? What is the purpose? I mean, so depending on what religion you look at, or you ask a scientist, they may tell you that life has no meaning and we're just here by an accident. Eleanor Roosevelt said this about life: the purpose of life is to live it, to taste experience to the utmost, to reach out eagerly and without fear for newer and richer experience. Life is what you make it, always has been, always will be. Your life is your own. You mold it, you make it. All anyone can do is to point out ways and means which you have been helpful to others. Another person by the name of Joseph Campbell said this: life has no meaning. Each of us has meaning and we bring it to life. It is a waste to be asking the question when you are the answer. And then another person that said this: there is not one big cosmic meaning for all. There is only the meaning we each give to our life. An individual meaning, an individual plot, like an individual novel, a book for each person. And that person's name is, I'm going to pronounce it the best I can, Aeneas Nin. And so you have three different answers here. Life is what you make it. We give meaning to our own life. Basically they're saying similar things, that there is no big purpose in life. There's no ultimate meaning of life. It's just whatever you make it. Or we're here by accident, just this random chance of something happening. But when you look at the Bible, life does have meaning. If you look at evolution, life doesn't have meaning. That because if we're just some accident, we're just some animal, then what does it matter what we do in life? I mean, I think that's part of the problem of what's going on with people. That there's no meaning in life, so they're depressed, they're discouraged. I'm not saying that's the only reason people get depressed, but that if there's no meaning in life, then that would be depressing, discouraging. But when we look at the scriptures, that life does have meaning, even if it's short. And so there's lessons and wisdom in looking at that life is short, but life also has meaning. That meaning is in God. And David here, he is troubled. That's why that in this psalm it deals with sin, sorrow, and the shortness of life. And we find David guarding his mouth, which is an interesting way to start off in the psalm that has to do with sorrow and sin and the shortness of life. But David begins by saying, for the choir director, for Jeduthun, a psalm of David, I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. Why is David wanting to guard his mouth and his ways? Even describing he'll guard his mouth as if he put a muzzle on it. A muzzle. When we think of muzzle, it put on an animal to keep, for example, if you muzzle an ox or an animal we don't, unless you're Amish, that most people don't use an ox or another animal to thresh, to gather the harvest. You now have all these machines that do it for you and do it a whole lot quicker. But they would put that on an animal to keep them from eating while they're threshing out. Or you put a muzzle on a dog who is biting and barking. You could stop it. But when you put a muzzle on a human's mouth, it's figurative, saying that I'm going to stop speaking. And he does this because he doesn't want to sin with his tongue. The reality is he doesn't want to sin anymore, adding to the sins he's already committed, and the reason that he's suffering. That is why he does not want to speak, and especially around those who are wicked, so that unbelievers, so his words are not misunderstood. And we could just say simply an unbeliever, because it doesn't have to be necessarily somebody who is wicked as can be. But the Bible often describes the wicked as even just an unbeliever, a lost person, the nice person next door, where they may take his words and misunderstand, or they may be, well, David's suffering. Why would I don't want anything to do with this God and misunderstand. And there's different ways that can be taken, or they can use it to blaspheme God's name. And so there's many different ways, and so he doesn't want this to happen. And there's wisdom in being careful with your tongue. I mean, Job, when he suffered, he didn't blame God or sin with his words. He lost everything. He lost his children, he lost his possessions, and then his health was severely stricken. And he says this to his wife's response, who told him to curse God and die. And he says to her in Job 2:10, but he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. Daniel, when he was thrown in the lion's den, did not sin with his lips. He didn't blame God. He trusted the Lord. He knew what was going to happen when he disobeyed the king's command and prayed. He knew what was going to happen to him. But he didn't say that, he didn't curse the king. He didn't blame God. He didn't do any of that. Daniel 6:21-22, we see Daniel's spirit the next morning. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, that they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that when they were thrown in the fiery furnace, they didn't blame God. They said, we're going to trust God. And so there is wisdom to not blame God and not to sin with your lips. Because we're often tempted to sin with our words when we suffer, saying such thing as, why me? I do not deserve this. God is being unfair, and many other words similar to this. But David's suffering is not like Job or Daniel's who had done anything wrong, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were all just simply obeying the Lord. Or even suffering David would experienced in his life because at the hands of Saul, who was trying to kill him. This time David deserves it because later on he confesses that he sinned. And so there is wisdom in straining your words, even if you're suffering because you're sin. Because we're tempted to say such words, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, or God is being too harsh with me. Yes, I sinned, I deserve a punishment, but I don't deserve to be disciplined this much. Rather, we should admit, I do deserve this. If we're honest, we should admit that we deserve far worse than what we're getting. But look at verse 2. He continues saying, I was mute and silent, I refrained even from good, and my sorrow grew worse. David just further describes he's mute, silent. He doesn't speak. He's being completely silent. Then he further describes that he refrained from good. What does that mean? I mean, he goes to the other extreme. That, yes, there's wisdom in not sinning with your lips, but he goes to the example of that where he's not even praying out loud. He's not praying. He's not praising God as God deserves. He's not thanking God for God's kindness and mercy and provision and all these things. Charles Spurgeon said, perhaps he feared that if he began to talk at all, he'd be sure to speak amiss, and therefore he totally abstained. It was an easy, safe, and effectual way of avoiding sin, if it did not involve a neglect of the duty which he owed to God to speak well of his name. And so when he remained silent and refrained from speaking well about God, his sorrow only became worse for him. Instead of praying to God. It didn't work out. You cannot keep silent totally. You can't go to one extreme or the other, where you totally blame God and get angry with your words, or totally silent and don't even praise God's name. You can't go on that. This is building up inside him. My heart, he says in verse 3, was hot within me while I was musing, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. It built up inside him. Things got only worse. He's not dealing with the issue, the problem. The more he thought of the problem, the worse it got, and you see, the hotter the fire in his spirit got. Have you ever been there where you just keep musing over something and you just get angrier and angrier and angrier? It just gets worse. It's building up. It's wise to be careful with your words so you do not sin, but it's also not helpful to allow it to build up inside, so then it just explodes like a volcano. And that or like a dam that's breached. That if you don't, with a dam, if you don't release some of that water that's building up from a flood, it's going to destroy the dam. You have to have these spillways that release water carefully, or else you're going to have a problem. By keeping silent, he added to his suffering. And that's going to happen to you too if you do the same thing. And then he finally spoke to God what was bothering him, because he says, I spoke with my tongue. Alexander McLaren said, it is the heart, not the mouth, that has to be silenced. To build a dam across a torrent without diminishing the sources that supply its water only increases weight and pressure and ensures a muddy flood when it bursts. I think of, if we just let things build up inside us without dealing with them correctly, not without going to the Lord, it becomes a problem. I think of this flood that it's been 8 years ago I learned about, I think it's been 8 years, the Jonestown flood. It was an awful flood that they built this dam very poorly. And it was just awful what happened, that it just destroyed towns. And just the power of the flood moved even railroad cars and slammed in the bridges, and things set on fire. And I mean, it was a terrible flood that happened out in Pennsylvania. But that's what it happens. This is burst forth. It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It only adds to the problem. It only makes things worse if we don't deal with it and take it to the Lord. And so there's 4 lessons we can learn from these first 3 verses alone. And James gives these James Boyce, I should say, gives these helpful lessons. First, he says what we say is vitally important. We can sin with our mouths as well as with other parts of our body. So what we say is important, our words we speak. That we're going to give an account of every idle word. And so what we say is important. And that starts with the heart first. That what we say with the words starts with the heart. And then second, it's better to be silent than to say things that can be used against God by wicked people. So we got to be careful with our words as well. So we don't allow unbelievers, because, it could be used to blaspheme God's name. It could discourage someone from coming to know Christ. There's many ways that this can be taken. Third, we should not be anxious to share such grief even with godly people. Now, he's not saying that we're never share with believers, because we are to pray for one another. Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and there fulfill the law of Christ. And we are to go and get counsel and advice from people. A multitude of counselors, there is safety. But before we talk to others, we should first talk to the Lord. And that's the 4th lesson. We should bring our troubles to God, to the Lord. We should bring Him our troubles first, and then we can go to people. Philippians 4:6-7, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so we bring our troubles, I say, to God. That be anxious for nothing. Take it all to the Lord in prayer. And so we find that there's wisdom in straightening our words, but we have to deal things rightly. But what is troubling David? What's causing this to build up, and where he wants to put a muzzle on his mouth, where it is welling up within him like a volcano, like a flood that's going to happen? What's going on? Well, let's look at verse 4 through 6. And we're going to learn it has to do with brevity of life. Wisdom learns that life is brief. Psalm 39, 3b through 4. Then I spoke with my tongue. Lord, make me to know my end and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. David could not keep silent any longer about what was bothering him. You know, some people are bothered about how long life seems. They want life to end. That they want their miserable life to end. That they don't want to live to be 100. They don't want to live to be 90. They don't want to live to be 80. It's just life seems drawn out and it seems long to them. And then there's some people who are bothered how short life is. That's what bothers David. How much time he has left on this earth. This is not something we think about when we were children, when we were teens, or in our 20s. When we were children, we were 4 or 5 years old. I mean, we think somebody that they may be 60, 70 years old, but we might think, to us, we might guess 20, 30, because to us we seem that's a big number. And so we don't ever think about how short life is, even as teens, because even with teens we thought we got everything before us, and then even in our 20s that we have so much life before us. But as we get older, we start to think about how long we have left on this earth. Do I have a couple years left? Do I have 10? Do I have 20 years? We start to think about that. And notice how David does not ask God to show him the extent of his years, but of his days, because his life is short, and our life is short. But we must first know that even though David, this is bothering him, it's not that he's complaining it's unfair that life is short, or that he's tired of this suffering and just wants it to end, that he wants to say goodbye to this miserable life. But that's not why. J.J. Stewart Perron expressed it this way: make me rightly to know and estimate the shortness and uncertainty of human life, that so instead of suffering myself perplexed with all that I see around me, I may cast myself the more entirely upon thee. And that is similar to what Moses asked God in Psalm 90, verse 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom, because that is wisdom to know that life is brief. One I can think of offhand, so we don't waste life. That life is brief. Look at verse 5 again. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. David compares the length of his life, and really our lives as well, as a handbreadth. A handbreadth was one of the shortest measurements. You know, we have rulers today. We could take out in school, we'd have to bring out, our stick that had a foot on it. If we had it, the teacher may have a yardstick, or even a meter that we can measure things. We have protractors and all this stuff to measure, even down to a fraction of an inch. But they use the width of your fingers, which is typically less than 3 inches across, unless you have huge hands. But what it was used to describe the briefness, the brevity, the shortness of life, is what it's used in the scriptures, that it's a handbreadth. It would be like us comparing life to a fraction of an inch, or even if we want to go to the metric system, millimeter. James compares life as a vapor. James 4:14, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. And he says this because of people boasting about tomorrow, that I have tomorrow, I can go and do this, I can do that. I'm planning a year from now that I'm going to go do this business. I'm going to do these things. But James says, don't boast of those things. You don't know what life will be like tomorrow. Your life is like a vapor. It's here and gone. That we think of the breath, that on a cold day, when we go outside and we breathe, we can see our breath. Well, how long does that breath stick around? About a second or so. Not very long at all. Our life is like a vapor, here and gone. I mean, you think about that, how long this earth has been around, and I know they say millions and millions of years. But we believe the Bible that when you add up all the genealogies, we got about 6,000 years. And you think about all those generations that have come and gone. That you take 6,000 years and a person's lifetime. Even Methuselah, you had some people that lived to be close to 1,000 years old. These generations. But our lifetime's gotten shorter and shorter. But you think about all these generations that come and gone. And let's say they're right about millions of years. That life is short compared to even more so when you say 1,000,000 years. But our life is brief. Why is life brief? Why is our lifespan? Some people live to be 120. Some people is, that 190 years old, and we're like, wow, that person, they lived a long time. 120 years? We can't even, we think about, wow. But the reality is that's short. It's no accident that it's short. Life is short. It's because God made it this way. God has made our lives short. And even with Methuselah, 969 years old, his life was short, brief on this earth. God made it that way. Look at verse 5 again. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. David said that you have made my days this way. God has done this for a reason, because he has done this. This gives life purpose and meaning. If he has done that, it gives purpose to life and meaning. That it's no accident. We're not here because of some accident that happened and because of evolution. We're not here because that our lives are not short just because of an accident. No, that reason must be good because God is good. And God is infinitely wise. And in his sovereignty and wisdom, he made our lifetimes as he did. Our lifespans, then David says that, that he said that my lifetimes is nothing in your sight. Now he's comparing to God. That I have compared 969 years of Methuselah's life to the life of this earth, the age of the earth, and even said, let's just say 1,000,000 years. But how do you compare eternity? God is eternal. 969 years is still nothing compared to God. 120 years, even more so. Nothing compared to God, because God is eternal. And even after the flood, we see these lifespans that gradually go down and down and down and down, until we get to Moses, who's 120 years old, and Aaron, I think it was 123 when he died. Psalm 90, verse 2 and 4. Behold, before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth, the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man back into dust and say, return, O children of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by as a watch in the night. And we know that even Peter says that 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years. The Lord, that because God is eternal. People try to use that to say, well, the earth is 6,000 years, it's going to end at the 7,000 year. I've heard people do that. That's not what the point is. The point is that God is outside of our time. He is eternal. And it's nothing compared to him. That life is brief, and it's even seen as more brief when you view it in the light of eternity, in the light of God who is eternal. And then we to look at that life is frail. Not only is it brief, but it's frail. So he's learning these things, that God has made it this way, that life is brief, and that life is frail, because it says, surely every man at his best is a mere breath. Life is a mere breath. That same word is used throughout Ecclesiastes. That's the key word in Ecclesiastes. When it says in verse 2 of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That word literally means it refers to a breath or vapor. The same thing when I use the example of your breath on a cold day. That's gone. A breath, a mere breath. Job 7:7 says, remember that my life is but breath. My eye will not see again. My eye will not again see good. That word was used in Psalm 90 verse 12 when Moses speaks about the brevity of life and a mere breath. Even James used a similar word that he talks about, that not boasting of tomorrow because you don't know what it holds, that life is but a vapor. So man at his best, at his strongest, we have people who are strong and they boast of their strength, people that boast of their wisdom, their knowledge, how smart they are. We have people that boast of their wealth and their possessions, that people that rule empires, that people who rule nations, who rule companies. Man at his best, or at least they'll present an image of these things, or boast of their health. But man is like a breath gone suddenly. You think about how many people just pass away in eternity. We don't hear about everybody unless you read the obituaries. And sometimes they don't even put everyone in there. But we often hear about the celebrities, that they had died, that they're gone. They were here and then they're gone. Life is short. Life is brief. And then look at verse 6. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. I mean, what does that mean? When you hear the word phantom, you think of a ghost. And that word describes that man as like a shadow. That here you're projecting like that it's not everything is there. Because you look at a shadow, that's not the real thing. That it can be used as, that even a ghost, even if people were to come back as a ghost, that's still not the real person. That we're walking about, that apart from God, life is in vain. The reality is that we walk about things that life is not real apart from God. Life is in vain. And then he says in verse 6, surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches, does not know who will gather them. Man spends his time doing what in his life? Gathering stuff on this earth like he's going to live forever. Amassing wealth. Solomon amassed so much wealth that he did whatever he wanted to do with it. That people and nations amass wealth and companies. They build these big companies and then, almost like an empire, and then they die, and who does it go to? Don't know who will gather them. And you won't know how they'll use them too either. I mean, that's what Solomon complained about, life under the sun, a life apart from God. He had all this wealth, and then it was gone much of it was gone underneath the sun. I mean, Ecclesiastes 2:18-19, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored on the sun. For I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. And yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is in vanity. Psalm 49:10-12, for he sees that even wise men dies. The stupid and the senseless alike perish and leave their wealth to others. Their inner thought is that their houses are forever and their dwelling places to all generations. They have called their lands after their own names, but man in his pomp will not endure. He is like the beasts that perish. People spend their time amassing stuff that, and there's nothing wrong with having possessions if they're viewed rightly. But people amass these things. Companies get sold. That some people, they go around and they're a fool who come after this person and run that company into the ground. And it's gone. The business is gone within a generation or two. You think about that people that they amass wealth, amass all these possessions, but after they're gone, some of that stuff gets put in a landfill or gets donated. Or given away. People have trophies for sports accomplishments, that people live for even sports. But what does that matter? What does all this matter? Well, it comes down to that stuff is futile. A life apart from God is futile. What is not futile is leaving behind a godly legacy. And this is not against, even as we've seen in the Proverbs, that it talks about a godly man will even leave an inheritance to his children's children or grandchildren, because he was wise with what he had, and he left behind something for even his grandchildren. It's not against that. But what is more important is leaving behind a godly legacy. What is more important is laying up treasure in heaven. Rather than storing up treasures on this earth that are going to end up in a landfill, rather we should do this. Matthew 6:20-21. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Lay up treasures in heaven. You use what God has given you for His glory and honor to further God's kingdom. Life is brief. We live for the Lord. And I'm not saying this as a cliche. I mean it. Live for Him and not the things of this world and the stuff of this world and possessions of this world and amassing stuff and making a name for ourselves that'll be here and we'll be gone and people forget. Except for maybe a few. If they crack open a history book. And so live for Him and lay up treasures in heaven. And use our time wisely as well, because life is brief. Life is very brief. We're here one day and gone the next. We don't know what today holds. I don't know how much longer I'll live, and neither do any of you. And next week we'll see that life has meaning in God and God alone, because we'll continue through the psalm that as life is brief, David comes to the point that he sees that hope is only in God, and God gives meaning to life. Life is not what you make it apart from God. Life is what you make it living for God.